yeah, there's plenty of these kind of points, but you want to start off with something like that where it's, you know, very clear, very distinct. You don't have to guess too much. All right, so let's find the inside information, and we'll start with this, you know, very nice spot over there. Here I'm just trying to guess where it relates, where it's situated in relation to the plumb line. We can also check the width again. My guess is a bit off. It's about right. Now this will seem a bit tedious, and you know, being honest, it is a bit tedious. But you know, this is, as a process, this is designed actually for you know, people new to drawing, so they can get something that they can really trust. You know, this would be way faster to do just visually, you know, mapping the shadow shapes here and there, and you know, maybe measure some strong points or some wider, well, not wider, some, you know, bigger measurements like this width right here, and you know, like this width right here where the shadow kind of ends. These kind of measurements would help you very quickly sort of map out the shadow shapes, but you know, I'm trying to stick to the process, so you can see that it works. With this way we don't have to visually compare as much when we're sort of building the structure, and then we start visually comparing basically once we have the shadow shapes in and most of the structure down. And basically this process is so that you get the structure down accurately. You don't have to, you know, struggle hours, you know, pushing things around. You can just get the shape in, and then after that we start, you know, little by little honing our eye by comparing these two when we have this, you know, pretty reliably in place. So maybe we'll just look for this shadow shape right here. I'll just measure where it ends on here. Measurements like this don't have to be like extremely precise. Just actually don't really need to measure it, but I'll just, you know, map it out anyway. And the reason is because you can see here the shadow edge is kind of very soft here. We can't really pick a single spot from here where the shadow ends, where it begins and turns into halftone. You know, we're gonna, you know, put some tone in here like here, and we will lose this spot anyway. This one is pretty sharp. We want that accurate because then we can base other things off it. Honestly, we can just map this thing out right here. We don't really need to do much else. We will come back to that and articulate it later. Now we at least have a similar looking shape over there, and we can refine it later. So things like this, maybe you can do it at home as well. You know, same thing would apply for example, this kind of spot over here where, you know, we want to find this shadow edge or the edge of the right butt cheek, and kind of turns into a cast shadow left by this form here. This edge is a cast shadow, and then it turns into the form shadow of this cheek. So there's a very, you know, sharp to soft kind of transition here, but there is, you know, a place where the cast shadow kind of ends somewhere around here, and we kind of would like to maybe find that because it's a pretty straight line over here. But maybe we could start by taking this measurement here, which is the end of the sort of dark outline of the butt cheek, and kind of the shadow left by it. Let's say it's not really an outline, I want to say, but you can take that measurement, and it's pretty close to the plumb line, as you can probably see, so we're just going to try to place it visually right around there. We can see there's just a little bit of distance, And maybe we try to find the right position for this end of the shadow shape here. And it's right around here. It's actually pretty low over there. Try to match the angle more or less. When you place a point like this, then you check, is this edge as close, or is it closer to the plumb line? Well, the plumb line isn't really visible over there, so we can't really check. So maybe the best thing we have to look at is this angle. Sorry, I'm casting a shadow actually. Let me turn on the other light. Better. So yeah, this angle, it feels, you know, pretty much in line with what we have. So let's just put it in there. And as I said, we try to be accurate here, but we don't really have to be that accurate yet. We will refine things later. And maybe from here we can take just the width of this shadow to that edge, from the plumb line that is. Maybe looking here, yeah, because I'm looking at this sort of triangle shape over here that goes over the plumb line. It's way too wide over here. Here there's barely a sliver, you know, before it actually turns into shadow. So maybe we need to move this shadow a little bit towards the right. Just have a guess and then remove this line. Maybe this would be better if we did it first, but you know that making that line over there actually helped me visually compare. So this is why we make soft marks. We can just move those around very easily. And let's try to re-measure that. So honestly, mainly for the height, we have to kind of guess the position, but yeah, somewhere around there. And even if you see me holding the pencil like this, you know, I'm still kind of trying to work along the paper. It's just the angles sometimes can be a bit, you know, tricky. And this is also a way to get sort of a bit of support for your hand. Okay. So now this is looking better in relation to that, and we can keep working. So let's measure again the width of this shadow. You know, the edge is gonna be somewhere around here. Just pull it all the way up in there. Kind of turns into, kind of rolls away from us, and there it's only half tone anymore. Pretty much, we don't really see the shadow anymore. And we just kind of make it into a couple of straight lines so we can see the shadow shape. And maybe here you start thinking about this kind of butt cheek over here, but you know, it's only in shadow. We're not going to draw that. We just draw the edge of the shadow shape. We will find this later. It's not really relevant information now because it's defined by reflected lights, which is, you know, a more advanced stage. We ignore stuff like that at this point. We ignore all the half tones, you know, everything happening in here. This is a shadow, so that one we're gonna put in. And maybe this one, even though it is very soft, so it's kind of tricky to put in with, you know, straight lines, but we can, you know, place it. I would maybe just put in these major shadow shapes at this point, and these I could leave all for, you know, a later stage. So let's keep mapping out this shadow shape over here. I'll just try to pick the edge of the shadow. Maybe I could have eyeballed this one because it's pretty much just right next to it, and it's a bit of a short distance to measure actually, but you know, just sticking to the process. Maybe here we make a mark first and then we see if the height is right. Height really meaning this sort of shape here, it kind of goes vertical and then to the right, and then it starts forming this shadow here. So let's try to measure that. And maybe here again we can just take a guess first, just kind of put something in there. Actually, I'm just gonna eyeball this shape here. That was too steep of an angle, so let's make it a little bit more shallow. That's closer. And now we have a shape that has a width here, so we can kind of roughly check, you know, are we in the ballpark? And it seems to be pretty exactly on the mark, so maybe with this we can just start dropping this shadow over here. And even if I'm trying to sort of take the roundness into trying to account for the roundness, but I still try to make, you know, straight lines because that's more accurate for this stage. Maybe this is a place where we can again compare to this drawing right here, and we can see, you know, Charles Bargue went more simplified on some shapes, and you know, we don't really have to do it with this many angle breaks. Even this is sort of a single kind of C curve and then a couple of straights. Maybe I have a little bit more of an angle break, but yeah, we're kind of in a similar place. What he has done is he has mapped out the edge of the cast's leg as well as the butt cheek, but as I said, we're gonna fill those out with shadow. We don't need to put in that information yet. We just try to remain kind of accurate with the placements of the edges of the shadows for now. Also has mapped out this line over here. This isn't really a shadow, so we're not gonna put that in. So yeah, you can use this to get an idea of how to put things in, but you don't have to put in things that we don't really need at this point. I feel he probably like wanted to have this example look like a final sort of stage, you know, where it looks like the cast already. We don't really need that. There's, for example, this line, no need for that. This line, no need for that. Yeah, there's a couple things that aren't really necessary at this point. But as you can see, these dark forms over here, he's just completely left out because those are, you know, they're basically details. All right, maybe it's time we start looking at this pedestal a little bit and start looking for a little bit more information. So let's just measure a width from here to here because it's a kind of a vertical line. This is probably going to be the most accurate we can get with this. So, and again, the pedestal has some complicated forms, but we can see, you know, it's been simplified at first. Just do a straight line, kind of keep it simple. We don't need to include stuff like this angle break over here, you know, this detail, basically this sort of slanted plane on the edge. We don't really have to include those things at this time. We can refine those later. Well, at the construct stage, I kind of indicated this break here because, you know, there are 2 points to measure from. Well, you know, we do this in our own way. We actually want to just make something that's useful for us, basically. Okay, let's just measure how tall this shape is. Let's see if we have something in the right ballpark. It's actually pretty tall. So now we run into a problem. So I think maybe this corner is too high. There's a bit of space. Maybe measuring from here, yeah, it could be a little bit lower, at least this point. So maybe we bring that measurement a little bit down. This space is a little bit, it's quite narrow, but still, you know, we want a little bit of space between here where the leg starts, and even here there's a little bit of, you know, vertical because of the curve of the shape of the leg basically against the pedestal here. So if we have that, the edge of the leg basically goes a bit higher, and all this kind of bottom of the cast would go higher in that case. But basically that just means that we're probably gonna lift this side and see what happens here later. We did measure these, so we're pretty confident in those marks. This maybe is the prime suspect, so let's check that in this case. Check that first. Maybe we could actually lift it a little bit, but let's check from another point like this one that we just measured, but just as a sort of easier checking point. So maybe we don't have to put it that high. Maybe it just moves a little bit further away. Just take the measurement again, try to be exact. So yeah, maybe we move that point a little bit higher. And on here we can see the point where the pedestal goes behind the leg is a bit higher than this, so that sort of relationship, we have it. Maybe it's not visible, it's pretty subtle, but because the camera is, you know, shooting from behind my left shoulder, so there's a bit of an angle, and I will correct that a little bit in post-processing, but it won't be perfect. So with that, I think we need to check this corner as well. For the corner, I'm actually trying to measure the sort of would-be point where, you know, these lines intersect, because there's this slanted plane, which means we have two corners pretty close to each other. So I don't get too confused by it in the future. You know, in the articulation, we can just chop off that corner instead of trying to, you know, figure out everything with the geometry again. So yeah, it's pretty much over there. Just simplify it again. Took out my point, but you know, let's make some new lines with this corrected measurement. I realized maybe I need to check the lower corner as well, so let's just do that. It's feeling a bit weird, so what's important is to check the height. So yeah, it's actually a bit lower than I thought. So no, it was just maybe my string slipped a little bit. So yeah, if you find you were off by, you know, 2 millimeters or so, then I recommend you just remeasure, because it might be it was correct all along, like it was here. But you know, you might kind of rush into things and then start fixing based on a single measurement. That could be just that maybe the string, you know, slipped a little bit, your thumb moved a little bit, and then, you know, it gets a millimeter or two off, and your whole, you know, the geometry of the pedestal, for example, is pretty picky on that. So we kind of want to remain realistic with that as well. We'll just check this measurement again, because I feel it's just a little bit too tall for these other points. So let's just move that down a little bit. So here's a lesson as well. You fix a thing by usually not just moving a single thing. We noticed initially that this point measured higher, and it created a problem where we kind of run out of this space between the cast and the pedestal's corner. You know, speaking of this space here where the top plane is visible. And we fixed that by pushing up this point, by remeasuring. That meant that we needed to remeasure this point, this point, this point. And then in the end, we also remeasured even this point that started this whole fixing. And I feel maybe it was a little bit high, but still had to be lifted from the original spot. So now I feel like we're kind of looking pretty all right with the geometry of this. Maybe I'll just put in this line It's starting to look similar, let's say, to the drawing. My line is a bit curved and doesn't really look too great, but yeah, that we'll refine this kind of geometry when we start working on the smaller details, but we don't really want to do that yet, so let's not get stuck on this. And finally redraw this line as well. Here you see me kind of finding the straight by searching with these light lines, and then we can carve it in with a kneaded eraser. It's a pretty handy technique. And we'll just ignore this measurement right here because it's such a small measurement. And we took it pretty early on, so now this is looking pretty all right. And now maybe we can just, you know, connect this line as well so we can get this kind of sense for the space between the cast and the top plane of this pedestal. So what you saw me doing here was working on this shape here, and as I said, I'm just trying to lock in on this project now a little bit, like just working as I would actually normally. So maybe you can see, no, so I can actually finish this thing eventually, because if I talk all the while I'm doing it, I will actually work very slowly, and yeah, this will take ages to finish then, which it will take anyways, but that's just part of it. It takes a while to get these things right. So I'm now working on the shadow shapes a bit more visually here. I'm comparing shapes like this kind of V that is formed here. I just had to measure where it kind of intersects with the plumb line, so I know where to place this shape. And we're just doing this so we can actually speed things up a little bit, and this is a bit more applicable. But at the start we measured a lot, because that way we can get the accurate outline to some extent, and after that we start having more information to compare to, such as this area right here, kind of this triangle shape compared to the plumb line, where I could, you know, just kind of block in the shadow shape that I'm seeing here, which kind of goes like this. These are more like halftones over here, these small things. So while you're mapping out these shadow shapes, you could also, you know, it's easy to kind of zone in and start just looking at shapes and not thinking about what they are, but it's good to also think what they represent. That also helps you, you know, think how they might work on the picture, which helps you avoid mistakes as well. So you can see that, like, these are the long back muscles over here kind of bulging out and creating a form. So the shadow edge is actually the form shadow casted by those. Okay, I think we've settled on the shadow shapes, and yeah, I tried to, you know, work them over, compare them visually to the reference, all this kind of stuff. They're not, you know, perfect exactly, but I think they're close enough that we can now fill them in with a tone. Now for filling in the tone, we talked about in the materials video about the paper stump. This thing, maybe it's not focusing, but well, maybe here you can see it's quite dark at the tip. Maybe it's not catching a lot of light, but it's a pretty gray thing already, but the tip is kind of saturated with tone. You can really get a pretty good tone just by working it without adding any graphite. This is a pretty light and even tone. And yeah, we can use this to add our shadow tone. We want to add it light at first. This stage requires adding shadow tones to the, well, tones to the shadows, just in order for us to compare properly and see if there's any, you know, discrepancies, because this kind of outline shape is, of course, you know, something to look at, but there's a bit of an optical illusion that happens when you have a dark shape versus a light shape, as opposed to just kind of outline shape. So it does help us see a bit more, and especially with the, you know, the widths and tallnesses and these kinds of things, where, you know, it really makes a difference. Sometimes a dark shape can appear a little bit, you know, larger or smaller than it actually is, just because it's dark. I'll just fill in some of these very small areas just by kind of working with the pencil. And maybe for the lighter areas, wider areas, it's more efficient to work with the stump. This tool isn't super precise, so I'll just use the smaller one. And if you don't have a very saturated stump like this, isn't as used as the other one, you can just kind of hatch in a little bit of tone. You don't have to make it super even. Just try to keep it within the lines. And then you can fill things in with the stump. It has a bit of graphite already in it. And a bit of graphite on the paper already helps as well. Working that way seems to cast a shadow, so you don't see very well. Sorry for this angle, I just need to see. If you want to, you can strengthen your lines a little bit before this stage, so you don't absolutely destroy your drawing, because it does happen with this kind of rougher work. But as you can see, you know, we can still pretty much see the shapes and all that stuff. So we don't really mind losing the drawing too much. We're gonna be finding it and losing it again and again during this process. If you wonder about this tone, we'll keep that for a later stage. We don't need to put it in yet. Also, with the shadows, we're gonna get a lot darker, you know, matching this tone later on, or rather this contrast between this. This is a white paper, this is a gray paper, so we're gonna keep the shadows a little bit lighter so the contrast remains the same. That's one of the things that makes drawing on a stark white paper a little bit more tricky than, you know, just picking the same color of a paper. You don't really have to think about that. That said, with a stark white paper, you don't have to go as dark as you would with the gray paper. So you can also consider that an advantage. The lighting really isn't ideal because most of my light is coming from right side. So when I place my hand here, it casts a shadow, even though I have a secondary light source over there. But since I'm right-handed, it does create a bit of shadow. I'm sorry for that. I guess one way you could sort of saturate this paper stump as well is just lay a very dark and deep tone on a paper, a spare piece of paper, and then, you know, just rub it in there all over, and after that you will have a pretty saturated stump because there's, you know, plenty of graphite on it then, and then you could just do it with the stump only. But I mean, you could just do it like this, where you apply a little bit of graphite and then spread it around using the paper stump. Becomes a fairly even tone, you know, good enough to kind of see the shapes properly. And please note, if you strengthen your lines before this, take care to do it still fairly lightly, you know. Don't leave a very dark line, because we still haven't arrived at the very finished outline. Obviously we still have some straight lines over here happening. And yeah, actually the next stage after the current one is articulation of the outline. Articulation meaning we start finding the very nuanced lines of the outline, and articulation of the outlines is followed by articulation of the shadow shapes. So even if you lose some things here or there, it doesn't really matter. We want to have these shadows so we can compare properly when we are actually choosing our final outlines, which we will do visually. Since you're a beginner, at least I'm assuming so, I recommend you take the kind of construct stage a little bit further in terms of, you know, because mine is fairly simple still, you know, we have a big straight line here, even though that's a round shape. You could break it up into two separate straight lines by adding a point here or there. Same thing goes here, you know, you could add something for the trapezius muscle kind of popping out of here. Yeah, well, the abdomen area here also, you could add more things, but yeah, just to make your job a little bit easier. But I'm not doing that. So the next thing we will do is we want to pick a new pencil. And I think the outline is pretty good to do with something around HB or even H, where you can get a pretty crisp outline. Since I'll probably be starting on the shadow side here, I'll pick an HB. And yeah, those harder kind of pencils maintain a sharper point, and I think it's a bit easier to control. With a 2B you lose the point pretty quickly, and then you end up getting some thicker lines than you would like. And also during this articulation stage we will be bringing out this guy, which is the maul stick, so we can actually go in and do a very nice line like this. And even if I'm holding my pencil like this, I'm still not going all in with a pencil grip, you know, writing like this. I'm still holding it further away. So I have this kind of more general control over the tip, rather than, you know, having to make big motions with my wrist to reach a larger movement.